All right, let's start this off. Why is it important for a country like Canada to accurately measure changes in the prices of consumer goods?
So first of all, again, thank you for having me. And I just wanted to reiterate that I'm not necessarily the expert on all of this. I think I could have pulled in a half a dozen different people off of the team, and they would have maybe even answered some of these questions better than I have. But I will try my best to answer everything that you provide. And if there's any inconsistencies, anyone from the public feel perfectly free to message us, and we'll be happy to kind of assuage any confusion. As for
And
your
you did
question.
just real quick on that. I think you did talk to other people on the team about these questions beforehand. So it's like we're hearing from you, but we're getting like pretty serious expertise kind of behind the answers to the questions you're going to give us.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's not just me, flopping around trying to answer some of these questions, but um, yeah, some of them, the more technical questions, it's a bit out of my wheelhouse, but we have the experts here. So, um, as for your question, so I think first and perhaps most importantly, inflation, along with a few other statistics that StatCan produces, are really important for measuring the health of an economy, the health of where the economy is going, and what direction it might take moving forward. The government and the Bank of Canada also use the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and related indexes to make economic decisions. And lastly, and also very importantly, measuring price change is important for a lot of social payments. CPP is tied to inflation. Some of the disability payments are tied to inflation. Welfare payments and even some minimum wages in some provinces are tied to the rate of inflation. So it's an important measure for those reasons.
Hmm. And how is CPI calculated?
Um, so there's a complex answer and there's a more simple answer. The very simple area is that we're kind of measuring everything that is consumed in the economy, and comparing it over time, using constant quality and constant quantity. So on a very very simple basis, we're trying to compare apples to apples every single month that we can. The backbone of that is the basket. So imagine uh, a shopping cart filled with all of the things that we consume in a month or in a year. That can range from food, that can range from rent to to hotels, motels, video games, puzzles, everything that you spend money on is given a weight based on how much you consume it. And then that weight is then used to measure the influence of that commodity on the overall spending. So, for instance, you're going to consume a lot more gasoline than you are milk. So the weight for gasoline is much higher than the weight for milk, and it goes throughout the entire basket like that. And what we do is we essentially aggregate up. So we will start at the lowest level. So you could take something like one of the indexes in shelter is rental accommodation. And rental accommodation includes your rent, but it also includes your utilities and it also includes your tenant's insurance. So all of those are weighted, and then they go up to the rented accommodation index, and then rented accommodation is a part of the shelter index, and it'll go with everything else that is involved in measuring shelter. And then finally, to get to the more complicated side, is that there's going to be specific ways to measure price change for different commodities. So take something like cruise ships. We measure cruise ships. And when you go on the cruise, it's when the price is measured when you made the purchase of that cruise. So some items we have immediate consumption, some items we have delayed consumption. So like a cruise ship is on average priced about or purchased about 8 months in advance. So we price it 8 months in advance. There's other things like air transportation. Different locations have different specifications, not specifications, but different behavioral um, situation. So like if you're flying to Orlando, right, classic family travel destination, it's likely that you have to book time off work, so you book that flight well in advance. But if you were, say, traveling to, Frankfurt or Chicago or cities that are more known for business, it might be something that you book closer to the date. So we'll take a number of dates when pricing air transportation, for instance. So those are kind of the specifics on how things are captured, maybe not calculated, but the whole point of how it's calculated is to have these different kind of methods for each index depending on how we consume them.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting. How are the actual contents of the basket decided? Like you mentioned a bunch of stuff, cruise ships, gasoline, milk, but like, how is it decided what actually goes in the basket and what weight is assigned to it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So nothing is really, there's no decision here or there being made. All of the data is publicly available. It comes from the household final consumption expenditure data from the System of National Accounts. So everything in there is then reflected in the basket. So there's nothing being decided on. It's more of just using that data to come up with the basket, and then using some other data points. So we use things like the telecommunications survey to figure out cell phone plans. We use travel data for the traveler accommodation and travel tours indexes. We use scanner data for the food from store, or food from stores index. So basically, the backbone is the consumption patterns from the household final consumption expenditure data, and then the meat and muscles comes from specific surveys for specific programs and indexes.
Interesting. And how frequently do you update the contents of the basket?
Another good question. So this is something that's changed somewhat recently. We've done four now, I think. Yeah, 4 consecutive years of annual basket updates. So that's something we introduced at the beginning of the pandemic, partly as a response, but partly as a the ability to do it was available. So we do it every year. As for how often things change within the basket, it's really dependent. So obviously the basket, as I said, is reflective of consumption patterns that are going on in the economy. So if something changes dramatically or quickly, then you'll find it in the basket one year and out the basket the next year. So something like DVDs or cassette tapes, records were out, and I think maybe they've come back in, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But a lot of the tech stuff comes in and out. We took MP3 players recently as well. DVD players were removed as well, and we've added things in addition as the data has become better. So there's been quite the demand, for instance, for more food data. Especially during the pandemic period when food prices seem to be always going up. So we added more meat, more indexes for meat, beef, pork, and chicken. And then we've also recently added more fruits and vegetables. Not that they weren't included previously, they just weren't published, essentially. They were just aggregated up into, beef was one, and then underneath now we have, all the different kinds of meat of beef, same with chicken, and so on. So yeah, it's updated every year, and that's a recent development.
How is like substitution, like when people switching to cheaper alternatives when prices do change? How is that, or is that captured in CPI?
Yeah, this is interesting stuff too. So measuring inflation is somewhat of a balance. You can have stability but lose relevancy, or you can gain relevancy but lose stability. So we think that the annual basket is a good way to kind of balance that out. Essentially, with substitution, what you're talking about is the substitution bias, which is inherent in kind of any price index. And that's that as prices increase, you make a choice to substitute something else out of that. and the basket weights are going to reflect previous consumption as opposed to current consumption. So in 2013, I think we moved from 4-year basket updates to 2-year basket updates. And now 2020, we moved to annual basket updates. And that's going to remove some of that substitution bias. It's never going to be perfect because you still have that stability question in place, because you're not necessarily sure that things are a trend. They could just kind of, work themselves out in the wash. Could be something like, beef prices are really high this month, so I'm going to buy pork, and then it flips the next month. So you don't want to be constantly changing your weights to reflect that constant change, which is why I think the annual basket update is kind of the perfect kind of situation, we think.
So something we hear a lot about is this concept of shrinkflation, right? Like prices staying the same, but then the quantity of goods being reduced, right? Like your bag of chips that used to be 500 grams is now 400 grams, but it's the same price. So how does shrinkflation get captured in CPI?
Yeah, firstly and importantly, the CPI accounts for shrinkflation. This is something that's it's been happening forever. It's when we were questioned. When we've been questioned about this earlier, I've kind of looked back at our IMF guidebooks and to see if the wording has changed, if this is a newer phenomenon that other statistical agencies are facing. And I found that the wording for a quantity adjustment, which is shrinkflation, hasn't changed since at least like 1986. So like this is nothing new, and it's something that we do all the time. It's kind of baked into our process to maintain constant quality and constant quantity. So if something gets flagged, if a bag of chips is a smaller quantity, it gets flagged in our system because it's a different product. We're trying to maintain like a 500 gram bag of chips to a 500 gram bag of chips, and 1 month there's not a 500 gram bag of chips anymore, then we know that something's changed and we have to adjust for that. We also recently released a shrinkflation infographic, which found that about 30% of eligible products in the food component were impacted by shrinkflation over the last, from 2021 to 2023. So that was pretty interesting thing. Anyways, to cut a long story short, when there is a change in product sizing, adjustments are made in the CPI to account for that impact on price. Similarly, on the flip side of that, there are other cases in the index where you get more and pay the same price, in which case we also do a quantity adjustment, but it doesn't have a fancy fun name like shrinkflation. We haven't come up with a name yet for that, I guess.
Hey, can you talk about what quality adjustments are?
So again, the whole goal of the CPI is to measure pure price change. And that means constant quality and constant quantity. However, over time, obviously products become outdated, technologies advance, and people's tastes evolve, and all of those things. So to ensure that we're measuring things over time, measuring the same items over time, we have to do constant quality. So when a new product is introduced, say a new cell phone, we have to try and understand what is the price change and what is the quality change portion. And one of the methods that we use for that is hedonics, as I'm sure you guys are familiar, and most some folks are familiar with this, which essentially puts a price on the characteristics of a product. So for a cell phone, we might look at the camera, the RAM, the storage, all of those things, and put a price on each of those characteristics. And then when a new product is introduced, we have a back price that we can compare it to based on these characteristics. We also use hedonics for other things, namely for rent, but we also use it when pricing things like ride sharing. Once the prices are adjusted to maintain constant quality, the remaining price movement is then reflected in the pure price change. Yeah, it's interesting because we always get the shrinkflation side of things where you're paying the same for less. It's rare that we really talk about, especially on the electronics side, about the improvements that come at the same price or roughly the same price. I think back to like the very first television that I bought was was, a tube television. I was 16 years old. It was $430. It was a 27-inch television. And now I think about a television that you could get for $430. Quite the improvement. So those are things that we have to account for when we're doing this kind of work.
It's an incredible amount of data, hey? Like, I didn't realize you're pricing like the components of, say, a cell phone, like the camera and the RAM and everything like that.
Yeah, it's I think we're like the rest of society. The more data that we get, the more we can kind of improve the CPI or enhance the CPI as much as is possible, because that's what we're striving to do in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, makes sense. So can you talk a little bit about why those quality adjustments are important to capture in the cost of living?
Yeah, it again, it comes back down to constant quality, where we need to be focusing on the apples to apples comparison. And if it's an apples to oranges comparison, then we're not doing justice. We're not producing a CPI. So quality adjustments prevent the CPI from becoming outdated or misleading in any ways. I think that we've also done a constant quality versus a quality adjusted CPI, and there are differences, and it tends to push the CPI higher than it should be as well. So this is kind of the most accurate way that we can reflect how prices are actually changing in the economy.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the quality is constant, but if people are paying more for cell phones, for example, that'll be reflected in the overall in the weight of the item. Does that make sense?
Yep, you're absolutely right.
Interesting. Why do you think this is one of the things that I often see skepticism about, that quality adjustments are, gaming the system or some? I mean, you just said, like, without doing the quality adjustment, CPI might be higher, and I think people see that and say, some people see that and say, hey, this is the statistical agency's way of putting downward pressure on inflation, and for some conspiracy theory reason. I'm not saying that. I don't agree with that, but why do you think some people are skeptical of the use of quality adjustments in calculating CPI?
That's a good question. I think there's to some extent, within an environment where prices are constantly increasing, or that sometimes they feel like they're constantly increasing, then for us to say, hey, this price is actually declining, or this price is actually decelerating, it goes against everything that we feel, and then we get maybe a bit defensive sometimes. The example that we always kind of cite is laptops. I think my first laptop in first year university was maybe $1,200 or $1,300, and it was, looking back on it now, it was great when I had it, but it's probably, just so outdated, and a laptop that I could get for $1,200 now is, light years ahead of it. So I think that's perhaps part of the story. It might also be that the quality adjustments that we do are sometimes on products that aren't purchased regularly by consumers. So you might not buy, a laptop every year. So you might have some price anchoring happening, or you might have some, you might not just, you won't see it as much as you see, the quantity adjustment that's happening with a bag of chips, where you're making you're buying chips every day or every week or whenever you're grocery shopping. So you'll see that, and you'll see the quality or the quantity adjustment that we have to do to make that more expensive. So you won't necessarily see that sort of thing. It's not a trick to lower inflation in any way. Most of it happens on the electronic side, which is a relatively small weight, but it's also absolutely necessary in order to measure pure price change. Otherwise, it would just be, it would be too subjective, and people would criticize us for being too subjective, which would be fair, to be honest.
It's funny you mentioned laptops. I just remembered my first computer, like back in the early 90s. I was like begging my dad for a computer so I could play Diablo, the first Diablo game that came out, because my friend had it. And so we bought this like super fancy computer, and it was $3,000 at the time. And I remember the hard drive was like 500 megabytes. And my friend's hard drive was 250 megabytes. And when I told his mom that I was getting a 500 megabyte hard drive, she just like scoffed at me. It was just like, that's so absurd. You wouldn't fill that up in a whole lifetime. And like I downloaded a PS5 game last week, and it was like 80 gigabytes for the one game. You know what I mean? So it's just interesting to look back on that. But it was $3,000, right? Like a new gaming computer today is also, you know, $3,000. And
So that's a great example. The other example that I wrote down here was like video game consoles and the different iterations, and the jump between, say, like the first gen consoles, and then that's, you know, monumental to the most recent ones. But there's such a small difference now between, say, you know, the latest iteration and the last iteration. You know, PS4 and PS5, maybe not that big of a difference, but there was a huge jump from like Super Nintendo to Nintendo 64 or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, so
I remember that jump very well. It was mind blowing to me at the time. I could never go back and play a Nintendo 64 game now though, because it just looks so terrible.
Nintendo 64 was mind blowing though.
That's what I mean. That's what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
it
Like
first
going
came
from
out.
Super Nintendo to 64,
Oh,
seeing like all
that's
those
what you're saying, yeah.
polygonated like images and stuff. It was like, oh my
Oh,
god,
yeah.
this is like virtual reality now, right? You're like,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, okay. So thinking of extreme periods of price changes, times like COVID-19, how was CPI adjusted during those times?
this is a good question. We don't get often asked like what our experiences were. So first of all, professionally, it was really interesting, really unique time. We had to navigate working in the office to working at home, like most people did. But we also had to maintain security. So there was a while where there was a limited number of people with security clearances to be able to work from home. So it had to, like, shuffling what we could do and couldn't do was a really interesting part of the process. I know that's not your question, but within that context is how we were working. And it gave us, it's interesting, like, you know, what's the saying, not catastrophe or is the mother of all inventions, or crisis is the mother of all inventions. Crisis kind of made us do a bunch of stuff that we were talking about doing, but maybe put off. So it was a good chance for us to modernize, for instance, and we started to seek out different sources of data for collection, because basically what we used to do was just send folks into stores. You know, when I first started out here, I went to a downtown grocery store with one of these price collectors, and she spent about 3 hours in the grocery store just collecting prices in this like handheld device, and we'd get as much data as we could from the price collector, you know, country of origin, price of stuff, quantity of stuff, all of that stuff. In COVID, obviously we couldn't do that. We couldn't risk employees, and grocery stores were open. But anyways, so we went to scanner data, we went to web scraping data, we went to administrative data as much as we could. And this, you know, in many ways enhanced the program because we were getting more data and we were getting a better view of the entire ecosystem. So now, I mean, we had scanner data in the CPI before COVID, but now we're more dependent on it, and it's been it's the enhancement to our data and the improvement to our data is really impressive. Canadians should feel really proud about the food data in the CPI in particular, and it comes from that scanner data, and it comes from you know, having all of that data, so having like weeks of data, as opposed to when we just send a collector into, you know, a random store on a Tuesday. That person might, you know, miss the sale that happens Wednesday, or miss miss the return from special on the Monday, you know. And now we have like a census of prices, so that was really good. We also, the basket was obviously a concern because there was lots of things that weren't available. And you know, we have a particular approach to things, specifically goods, when they're out of stock, but our systems weren't designed to handle when services are out of stock. Like, that was just a foreign concept to us. So we had to modify our approach to that. We also released the adjusted CPI as well, using Bank of Canada data to update weights more regularly.
Hmm.
So we used their data and we compared it. There ended up being not that big of a difference between the adjusted CPI and the regular CPI. But it was still a great learning experience to see how things would look with a more frequent basket update, if you will. At the headline level, obviously there wasn't much difference, but there definitely was a big difference in areas where we would all expect there to be, restaurants, tuition, women's clothing, insurance. Those just come off the top of my head where they were coming from, and it makes sense,
Yeah.
So that's COVID for us in a nutshell.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned the term scanner data a few times now. Would you mind just explaining what that means?
Yeah, so scanner data is a point of sale data, depending on how you want to call it. Basically, a number of grocery retailers send us the scanner data. So every time you go through the grocery aisle and scan an item, we get that data. Not your personal data in any ways. It's just the product data. And it covers about between 70 and 80% of the Canadian market share for food prices, for grocery prices. So yeah, it's kind of the absolute gold standard for price collection in the world, in fact.
Got it.
Yeah.
It is very cool. Why does Canada only report on one CPI measure? Like, I think in the States, they have a couple different measures for different population groups, but we only have one.
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, I think this might be a bit of a problem with our communication strategy to some extent, or a challenge of our communication strategy, because we do produce a lot of other indexes. So we produce on all items excluding food and energy, all items excluding shelter. We produce a whole bunch of special aggregates that are out there that can be used by the public if they so happen. We also produce the core measures for the Bank of Canada. I can explain those too if you'd like, but there are other aggregates that are produced, and it's probably our communication strategy that's part of the problem as to why people don't have access or maybe can't find those. As for your question about different measures for different groups, it's a fascinating question, because we've studied this before in the past. We used to produce a CPI for specific groups. So in my research for this podcast, I came across this really interesting article they wrote in the 80s where they produced a low-income families, unattached individuals, and low-income seniors CPI, along with the all-item CPI. And they started producing it, I think they started studying it from 74 to 78. They introduced it in 78, and then it ran until, I think, the late 80s. And it basically showed no difference between the three measures over the 8-year period. There's some ups and downs and some variability within it, but for the most part, it showed no difference. We also did a study in 2019 on a CPI for seniors, in which case it looked at prices over a 5-year period, and it found a 10 basis point annual difference between the CPI for seniors and the all item CPI. So not really that big of a difference. We did a similar study in the late 90s for seniors and low income folks, and again, there wasn't much of a difference. So I think part of it is just that there isn't that much of a difference. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's interesting. And if you keep going down that path, you can arrive at this concept of like personal inflation, right? If you keep kind of grouping people, you can get to this point where everybody's personalized inflation rate is different. Like we've been talking about video games, for example. And if I spend a disproportionate amount of my money on video games and video game inflation is high, then my personal inflation rate might be higher than what you guys report. So do you think it makes sense for people to calculate their own personal inflation rates?
That's a really great point, Mark. I think, so first of all, we have a personal inflation calculator on our website. I think a handful of media outlets have put out personal inflation calculators. I think they are really interesting to see, how your spending decisions are reflected in the data. Maybe you can make adjustments to say save more over time. I think it's important to note that your personal experience of inflation probably won't match the Canadian averages due to differences in those spending habits. And it's important to note that the all items CPI, Consumer Price Index, is a average Canadian. You're right. So if you're a renter, you're likely not a homeowner. But owned accommodation is a huge part of the CPI. And similarly, if you own your own house, you're probably not renting, but rent is in the CPI. So in that case, it's best to maybe look at your own personal inflation. And again, like going back to my previous point there, demographic specific indexes that StatsCan has produced in the past track pretty closely. Where you might see some differences are probably in the individual indexes. So when we did the senior price index, we found that, again, this probably isn't shocking to folks, but at a statistical agency, we need data to support some sort of conclusion. But we found that seniors were probably out of their mortgage, so they were spending very little on mortgage interest costs, but they were probably a little bit unhealthier compared with the youth cohort, so they were spending a bit more on medications. Similarly, we could probably assume that young people are spending more on rent and probably less on medications. So those specific circumstances that you described, Mark, are definitely true. And the other useful thing about the personal inflation calculator is if you are negotiating a wage increase, it might be a useful number to argue that you want to maintain your purchasing power, and that the official CPI doesn't represent you, but this other product that is also produced by Statistics Canada says that I should be getting a higher wage.
Nice. I'm gonna keep that in my back pocket. My boss will be.
That's a really interesting idea, though. I had not thought about using that tool for that purpose.
Yeah.
You made an interesting point just now. So that the composition of the demographic specific baskets can be very different, but it kind of all sounds like it all comes out in the wash to relatively different, like rolled up differences in price changes.
Yeah, I honestly think, Ben, it has to do with the weights, the relative weights. Like shelter's about 30% of the basket, food's about 16%, clothing's about 5%. So like shelter and food aren't going to change that dramatically based on different demographic groups. So if those are kind of constant, then you kind of just get into the margins, and those margins aren't going to be that big. I think that's essentially why.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. I want to ask you about something that you guys have done papers on that are some of my favorite papers on this topic, and I've enjoyed reading them as I've tried to understand the answer to the question: what is the difference between the price of a house, the sticker price that someone sees, like $1 million home or whatever? What's the difference between that and the cost of housing?
Oh, this is a great question. I'm glad you read the papers. That warms my heart. So the methodology for owned accommodation services is that housing is a service as opposed to the purchase, which is an asset. So in the CPI, we only incorporate the price of that service into the index as opposed to the asset side of things. Just because we don't think the purchase of a property it's not a consumer good, and that's essentially what we've done. That being said, there are several components within the CPI that do include housing prices, or they'll impact the CPI based on the change in housing prices. So, we have other owned accommodation expenses, which would include your realtor fees and your lawyer fees associated with buying a new house or buying a used house or resale house. We also have homeowners replacement costs, which is it uses the NHPI, the new housing price index. So if the new housing price index is going up, homeowners replacement cost is going to go up as well. Similarly, if the price of a house is going up, property taxes are also likely going up. Same with mortgage and home insurance as well. And maintenance and repairs as well, which is a factor as well in housing, is also going to be influenced to some extent by housing prices. If housing prices are going up and there's a construction boom, then there's probably going to be some supply issues associated with those renovations. So yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you kind of just got into this, but how does StatCan calculate the cost of owned housing for the CPI?
Yeah, so we use it's the technical way we describe it is it's a variant of the user cost approach. So we just measure the ongoing costs of ownership, of home ownership. So I mentioned homeowners replacement costs, property taxes. We also measure mortgage interest costs of the mortgage interest component of your house, insurance, maintenance and repairs, other owned accommodation expenses. So all of those costs are in our shelter index, and they all come from various sources. So for instance, MECI comes from, our mortgage interest cost index comes from the Bank of Canada's A4 insurance data. Homeowners replacement cost a portion of it comes from the new housing price index. Property taxes are a bit labor intensive, but they come from every municipal office in the country. Homeowners insurance, how's that? I've written down where we get it from here. It uses a broad range of consumer profiles extracted from some alternative data sources. And then maintenance and repairs, we get the data from retailers. And then we also use the construction union wage rate index as well. And then other owned accommodation, which is like, again, the lawyer fees and the realtor fees comes from the new housing price index and then CREA data. So the Canadian Real Estate Association data. So yeah.
And do the municipalities send you the property tax data automatically?
Yeah, it's an incredibly labor-intensive exercise, and the folks who work on it do an amazing job. They probably start getting the data around, so it comes out in October. They probably start getting the data July, August, trying to get their ducks in a row, and then go through it. And I wish it's one of those presentations I wish we could make to the public, because the commodity experts who work on it will literally go from coast to coast and go through, like, small town in Quebec, they've raised their sewer rate by this amount, and that's why it's incredible bit of work. They should be praised for it. I respect what they do. So yeah,
that is wild. We've been going through this project where we wanted to compare the financial outcomes for renters and owners going back to 2005 to 2024. It's full 20 years of data. And one of the things we had to do was get the municipal property tax data. We only looked at 12 cities, so like nothing like what you guys are doing, but just that for those 12 cities, going back to data that predates what's posted publicly on their websites. It's crazy. Like you have to go to each one and ask them. Anyway, tons of respect for what you guys do and the amount of data collection that you're doing.
The other challenge is that sometimes, like, we also have to conflict the data to make sure that it's accurate. So we'll oftentimes go through, the local newspaper who's always reporting on these things. As a sort of a side note, I was just talking to my colleague this morning, and she had tremendous respect for the podcast you guys did on renting versus owning. It's a really good podcast, and if anyone,
nice.
Not that I should push your product on your show, but if anyone hasn't listened to that, great show, great episode.
Awesome, thanks. I'm hoping to do a paper based on that. I just needed to finish. I wanted to get the end of 2024 data, so it's a full 20 years, and then we had a few more property tax rates to clean up. Yeah, hopefully later this year. Okay. How does Statistics Canada's approach for housing, so the modified user cost of housing that you just mentioned, how does that compare to what other statistical agencies are doing around the world?
It's a good question. So first of all, there's no real clear consensus regarding the best methodology for owned accommodation. Oftentimes, it's kind of the availability of data and the specifics of the market that is the reason for certain countries doing it the way that they do. So probably the most popular is the rental equivalence model, which is used in the US, Mexico, Germany, and the UK. And it basically relies on the estimates of the price of current consumption accommodation services, while rental equivalence prices do not directly reflect the housing pricing effect. They do capture kind of the indirect changes that occur when prices increase. No country uses the net acquisition model, so nobody prices the purchase of a home. But there are other methods, and it's kind of like, as you know, we released the paper I think last March, and we kind of showed what the CPI would look like with the different models, and we found it was a lot more hectic. It was a lot more up and down. Rental equivalents, I have an old colleague who used to say it's like a freight train, and once it gets going, it's tough to stop. And that's part of the reason why rental equivalents in the US hasn't slowed nearly as much as say shelter in our index has. That being said, their data is really tailored to the rental equivalence approach, so that's why they've chosen to. I don't know why they've chosen their model. You probably have to ask them, but I think that's one of the factors that goes into the decision making. They've went in using that index.
And what do you think are the benefits and the drawbacks of using StatCan's approach?
Good question. We never like to talk about the drawbacks, but there are drawbacks. So first of all, it does fit the user purpose. So StatsCan has a quality dimension criteria, and those are fully met. It's consistent with the cost of living, and it's suitable for escalation of income and payments. So for that reason, it's a benefit. The drawback of our approach is replacement costs. It's a notional cost, which is based on the hypothetical depreciation rate. So we've been challenged in the past that we're double counting by including maintenance and repairs and homeowners replacement costs. And my director made a great point when I was asking about this last week, and he was saying, well, maintenance and repairs tends to be renovations and tends to be, fixing a kitchen, fixing a bathroom, that sort of thing. And replacement costs is probably more like the bones of the building. So how often are we, redoing the foundation or, redoing the skeleton of the house? It just doesn't happen. So that's why we think replacement cost is pretty important to include, even though it can be considered a drawback by some. There's also the circularity of the mortgage interest cost index. So as the policy rate changes with the Bank of Canada, it'll go up to reflect that, and then it'll go down when the policy rate is going down. So for that reason, it's a bit of a drawback. But yeah,
doesn't that make sense though? As the cost of capital is changing, the cost of housing is changing.
Absolutely. But it's one of those, we get lots of questions where it's a bit circular. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates to fight inflation, but MECE is going up. And I think the Bank of Canada talked about it in a few of their MPRs, monetary policy reports, where they talked about how their expectations on shelter were different, or not different, but they misbehaved a little bit this time around. Usually when MECE, when interest rates go up, then rent behaves a little bit differently, or in the past it's behaved a bit differently, and it didn't this time. So that for that reason they were a bit turned off. But yeah,
interesting. I think the maintenance costs and depreciation as separate items, that makes sense. I don't think that's weird at all. And lots of other academic papers I've read on that topic also treat them as separate. Sometimes you'll see like a net depreciation that's net of maintenance spending. But yeah, they make sense that they're separate items, because I think they are for exactly the reason that you said.
Yeah, appreciate it.
What about rents? How are rents calculated in the
CPI? Rent's an interesting index. So rent is collected using a questionnaire in the labor force survey. So it's a supplementary question. Obviously, the labor force survey measures unemployment, but there's a whole bunch of other questions that are in that sample, or in that survey. So the survey follows a household for 6 months, and then 1/6 of the sample is replaced every month. So the dwellings are followed, not the households. So the tenants might change during the survey period. Approximately 8,000 units can be used in the CPI rent index calculations each month. And as of January 2019, I think it was 2019, we started using a hedonics model. as we mentioned before. So this is putting a price on characteristics, as we said. So we looked at different variables such as the age of the dwelling, the number of bedrooms, the type of dwelling, locational characteristics that are captured by postal codes, and then we just make sure that we're comparing the same things over and over, and we're not comparing, a 1-bedroom to a 3-bedroom, that sort of thing. And then lastly, the rent index encompasses the whole market. So that includes folks who just signed a new lease, folks who are in a lease, folks who've renewed a lease, people who are in a rent control building, people who are not in a rent control building. So all of that is covered in the index. So oftentimes we maybe get some questions about rentals.ca's number, and we don't necessarily fall as quickly, or go up or fall as quickly. And part of the reason is that they're doing listed apartments or places, and we're doing the entire census of the rental market.
Yeah, that makes sense. So market price rents versus average rents that people are actually paying.
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, how well does CPI capture perceived inflation from surveys?
So this is an interesting question, because we're kind of always bantering about perception, because we actually don't do any perception surveys, but we do track the Bank of Canada's 2 surveys, the Survey of Consumer Expectations and the Business Outlook survey, quite closely. We did a study in 2022 specifically about the difference between the perception and the actual CPI. So it's not something that we do, but it is something that we look at a lot. Part of it is also goes back to that messaging and that communication, where are we doing enough to get it to share with Canadians what's happening, and why maybe their perception of inflation might be different. Yeah.
So what does it show though? Like, is there a difference between the perception and the actual measured CPI?
Yeah, there's been a gap for a number of years, especially since post-pandemic, probably since 2022 or so. There's been a big gap between consumer expectations of inflation and actual inflation, and it's a bit less noticeable on the business side of things, which is interesting. We're not sure about why, what's driving that. We have some ideas, and we can talk about those ideas if you'd like. But it is a noticeable gap, and it's noticeable in Canada more than elsewhere. They don't necessarily have the big perception gaps that we do. So I'm sure you guys follow the University of Michigan Consumer Expectations survey that came out, was it last week, a couple weeks ago? It was talking about inflation in the U.S. at 3.5%. In Canada, in the Bank of Canada's survey of consumer expectations, there's a big section of the population that thinks we're either going to be in deflation or in inflation above 5% a year from now. And that's pretty scary. If we're in deflation, or if we're in a situation of inflation at plus 5%, maybe the tariffs change, part of that equation. But we're probably in a pretty bad situation overall as an economy, if that's the case. And if, a significant chunk of Canadians believe that, then it's probably something to do with how we communicate our numbers, at least part of the story.
We will ask about your ideas behind what you think drives the gap, but I also want to ask before that, is the perception versus actual inflation gap the same across different population groups, or is there variation there?
Yeah, so that study that we did, it's on our website. You can read it freely. There were some differences between groups, for sure. Households that are homeowners versus renters, lower income versus higher income, households with university education and without. So we looked at kind of all of those. I was really interested in that paper. We found that consumers age 31 and up displayed a stable perceived inflation rate around 2%, while younger consumers had a higher and more volatile perception of inflation, which I thought was interesting. And yeah, I think that gap between groups is noticeable, and it's also probably partly due to, it could be due to how those consumers spend their money or where they spend their money, and that makes total sense. So headline inflation over the last 5 years, from January 2025 to January 2020, I think, headline inflation grew almost 20%. Actually, let's get specific. 17.9%. Food during that same period, 21.8%. Shelter during that same period, 27.3%. So between food and shelter, those are your essentials. Those are things you worry about. Those are things that you're spending on a continuous basis. So if that eats up a bigger chunk of your overall expenditure, then you're likely seeing inflation at a higher rate than that 17.9% that I started with. And that only makes sense to me, at least.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so what are the main drivers of the inflation perception gap?
It's a great question. I think we could talk about this for an hour and a half, and I don't know that we have any specific data that I could share with you. We don't have the data, period, so it's not like I'm holding it back. But we do have some thoughts as to why these things might be happening. So I think, first of all, maybe just start with first of all, I think there's a misunderstanding between price levels and price change. And we've tried to kind of change that narrative by putting some longer timelines in some of our releases. So I say price levels versus price change. So in the behavioral economics literature, there's always talk about, heuristics and about price anchoring, and loss aversion and things like that. So when someone says prices have increased by a certain amount, they might say, okay, well, prices haven't increased. So food prices have increased. Food prices declined January 2025 to January, compared with January 2024, by 0.6%. Okay, that's great. That's 12 months, right? But over the 5-year period, they've increased 21.8%. Over the 4-year period, it's 20.6%. And consumers haven't had a chance to anchor their price expectations at this new level. So we've seen this dramatic level shift that consumers haven't yet come to grips with, I suppose. And their perception then is just that prices are a lot higher, and they couldn't have declined 0.6%. It's got to be something much bigger. And they'll quote, a 20% number. And you know what? They're bang on. 4 years ago, prices are 20.6% higher compared with 4 years ago. So I think that's maybe part of it. I think the frequency of purchases is also important to keep in mind. Food prices, gas prices, items that are purchased on a regular basis tend to hit you in the head more often versus prices that you don't purchase all the time. So I mentioned that $430 TV that I bought when I was 16. How often are you buying a TV? How often are you buying a lot of items in the CPI? You're not buying that often, so maybe you don't notice the price change as much or as frequently. And then I think there's also those large item purchases. So couches or electronics or appliances, things like that. Couch prices we saw go up quite a bit during the tail end of the pandemic, when we were having those supply chain issues, and the cost to ship an item from Asia was quite high. So we saw pretty big increases in furniture prices. It also coincided with probably the peak of the housing market, or the recent peak of the housing market, in which case when people buy a new house, oftentimes they buy new furniture. So they wouldn't necessarily see, they've just bought a, I don't know, $500,000 house. Is it to spend, I don't know, $5,000 on new furniture versus $5,500 in furniture. Like within that context of those big purchases, a 10% increase, which is a difference between 5,000 and 550, is big relative to an all item CPI that's supposed to be within target of 1 to 3%. So I think for all of those reasons, we see this perception gap that's emerged for sure.
We talked about quality adjustments earlier. What role do you think that plays, if any, in the inflation perception gap?
It's a great question, because I think it fits within the context of prices are going up. How can you say that they're going down? So and maybe it does speak to that heuristic of loss aversion, where I don't see my new cell phone as a quality improvement. I see my new cell phone as just a new cell phone, but we have to treat it as a different kind of cell phone, because that's what it is. And where they're most punished is on those frequent purchases. So you might buy a cell phone every 2 years, 3 years, or something like that. So it's an infrequent purchase to begin with, versus the bag of chips that you've been purchasing for every week for 10 years, and all of a sudden the bag's smaller, and you're upset with someone for that. And if the inflation number is saying, hey, prices are going down, or prices are not increasing it at the same rate that you do, as you're upset about this bag of chips or this other item at the grocery store, it makes sense why you would think that the inflation was higher than it actually is.
So we talked a lot about housing, and it's a hot topic, obviously, and always is. And I live just north of Vancouver, so I know what housing inflation looks like, just as a sort of bystander. But how important do you think housing is in explaining the perception gap?
Yeah, it's good. So Statistics Canada does produce other numbers, as you guys know, that show price of housing and how the price of housing has shifted over the past 20 or 30 years. And it's one of those things where the CPI isn't the right measurement to have the price, the price tag of a house. But within the context of higher rent prices, of higher overall costs, so rent prices over the last 5 years have increased 26.2%. So if that's a significant chunk of your spending, then you're going to think that the inflation rate is higher than it actually is, which makes total sense. And that's perhaps why the personal inflation calculator is so important, and as to why or how we can try and communicate with the public that, yeah, you are experiencing a higher price level than what's happening in the all items number. So I think it fits within that broader context of essentials, and how essentials fit into spending behaviors, and then how they fit within the CPI itself, because they certainly are increasing at a faster rate than some of the other items in the index. I always bring up clothing and footwear. So clothing and footwear prices have declined almost 5% compared with 5 years ago. And we don't talk about it at all.
Yeah. I don't know if Ben's have, because Ben has size 24 custom made shoes. I don't know if those get more expensive or not, but
Size 17 or 18, Mark, not size 24.
close enough. Everything over 15 is just a big, ridiculous number. So
They're hard to find. It's true.
I believe it.
I think on the housing thing, like what we talked about earlier, the difference between house prices and the cost of living in a house, I think that probably also contributes to perception being different from the way that the cost of housing is measured. People see house prices, not so much recently because they've fallen a bunch, but when they were going up and up and up, people were saying, well, the cost of housing is going up by that much, but it's not really.
Yeah, I also think that the mortgage interest component too is, a bunch of folks who are going to have to renew their mortgages, and they were used to prime plus, what was the interest rate in the lowest point of the pandemic, 0.25, and now, we're at a slightly higher rate, but historically it's not that high. But if you're all of a sudden the interest component of your mortgage payment has gone up by a lot, then you're going to perceive that, because you're also going to be spending less on other things that are important to you. And you're going to blame higher prices, rightfully so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. What do you guys do to try and address that? Like you said, that you have a lot of kind of internal banter about inflation perceptions. What do you guys do to try and communicate some of the stuff that we're talking about to the public?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do, we have tried to our official release, the daily, it comes out on release day. We've tried to incorporate longer time horizons in some of our analysis. We've tried to point out things like, food prices have declined by 0.6% in January, but they're still a lot higher than they were 5 years ago or 4 years ago or even 3 years ago. So framing it within the context of like, we know that prices are higher. The traditional measurements that the traditional measures that we use to communicate price change, which is usually the month over month and usually the year over year, are perhaps a bit outdated within the context of this period that we've just kind of gone through. So that's one of the ways we've tried to communicate. We try to host regular AMAs on Reddit, where we do get a lot of questions like this, and then those questions or those answers are up there permanently, and folks can go back and look at them. We've done presentations before. This is a great opportunity for us. Again, thank you for the opportunity to kind of discuss the program. So we try to reach out to Canadians as much as we can. I work on a great team that handles most client requests, and we're happy to talk to anyone. We're happy to email anyone. We work for you guys. We work for Canadians. So our job is to kind of disseminate this work and to share with you what is essentially yours. So yeah, we try to reach out, and we'll keep trying, and we'll keep exploring like new avenues to approach Canadians. But the good news is that perception gap has kind of started to shrink, which is a good sign, I think. But it might just be a lagging indicator as well, that it just takes time for people to kind of realize that the prices aren't shifting nearly as much as they were, in 2022.
Yeah, great answer. Okay, so what does StatCan do to make sure that the differences between inflation perception and CPI are not reflective of the real differences that should be captured by CPI?
Yeah, this is a really important question. As we said, consumer expectations in some of the other countries, UK, US, and some of the European countries, is more in line with their CPI, which again does suggest probably a communication issue that we're having. I think the way that we try to deal with it, to make sure that it's not a real issue, is we have a independent board which oversees our work. They're independent expert advisory committee. They're made up of statisticians from around the world. They're made up of professors around the country. They know what they're talking about, and if we have a problem or if we have a challenge, we go to them and ask for their advice. So we seek as much kind of outward advice as we can to make sure we're doing everything correctly or everything appropriately. Make sure that other statistical agencies who've run into their similar situations are handling it in a similar way. It's kind of a constant process of making sure that we're doing things right and trying to be as honest as we can be about our limitations, and at the same time trying to improve and enhance the program as much as we can, because it is important to understand what these real differences might be and where we might be failing in either our communication strategy or in the CPI itself. If it's within the CPI itself, that's a huge problem, and it's something that we should have addressed before it became a problem. Luckily, I don't think it is. And I think it's because we have kind of all of this support kind of in the background, making sure that every part of the CPI is strong analytically, that there's a good foundation. We have 2 price experts on that are kind of hovering above us at all times, that are really, really good at what they do. And one's kind of a historian of the CPI, so he's great to go back to and talk to about what we did back then. And the other gentleman, designed or helped to design the core measures for the bank. So he's someone we always go to whenever there's kind of a problem with, hey, are we missing this, or is this something that we can handle better? I think we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the challenges that we faced, and I can talk more about how he's helped in that kind of process as well. So.
Yeah, challenges like I think maybe that's what you're referring to in this question. I want to ask what indexes you receive the most criticism for.
So first of all, I think essential purchases are often in people's eyes, and maybe for this reason we faced a lot of criticism on how we price some of those essentials. But I think it's really ironic that we faced a lot of criticism on the food index in particular. I say ironically because, as I mentioned earlier, food prices in the CPI are captured using that point of sale data, which is honestly like the gold standard of price collection. I don't think we could do it any better. It's incredibly impressive. We take 2 weeks of data every month, all across the country, from stores across the country, different retailers, everything. And it's a census essentially of a significant portion of the food market. And it gives us quantity, it gives us price. It's so helpful for constructing the weights. And it's so ironic to us that we're being challenged on that index. We've had to go before Parliament a few times to kind of address concerns. We talked earlier about the shrinkflation part of things. We've had to put out work on that because it's something we obviously do. So it's interesting that we've faced a lot of pushback on that food when it is such a quality index. So that's one of them. Cellular services, something we a bit of a challenging time. I don't know if we've gotten too much pushback or criticism for, but it's a challenging index in particular. It's this was the index I was referencing when I was talking about the price expert kind of coming in at the last minute when the market changes really, really quickly. So it's actually something I worked on when I was a young production analyst. 1 year, what year was it? I think it was like 2019. All of a sudden, the cellular companies came out with these unlimited plans, and we didn't know how to work that into our profile because at the time, cellular plans were, you pay for long distance charges, you pay for, a certain number of SMSs, you pay for data, obviously, and like we didn't know how to react. At the same time, we were splitting. It's probably less of a thing now, but even like 5 or 6 years ago, you remember when you bought a cell phone, or not, when you bought a plan, the cell phone came with the plan. And that was really kind of unique to the North American market, or to the Canadian market in particular. So we were pricing those things, and it was a challenge to kind of work its way through those changes in the market to now where we're at, where there's a lot of bring your own device things, and there's separate charges for the phone, and we've moved away from having to pay for long distance, having to pay for text messages, that sort of thing. So that's been unique. And then based on the data that we get, or the quality of data that we've get, it's started to improve a lot lately, is that we're kind of pricing what's available online, and we're not getting like the buyback plans that you might get if you cancel your plan and somebody calls you back and is like, hey, can you come back, we'll give you this rate. We weren't getting that. We weren't getting retention offers. We weren't getting cold called offers that were just come join our plan. And then there was also always questions about kind of the utility of data, or the utility of each additional amount of data. there's a big difference between like 1 gigabyte of data to 2 gigabytes of data. Like that has kind of dramatic impacts on the utility of the experience of the user. But for all intents and purposes, 1 gigabyte to 2 gigabytes is the same as 42 gigabytes to 43 gigabytes. In both cases, it's 1 additional gigabyte. And I think there was legitimate concerns about the utility of all of that. Are you using all of that? The way we kind of got around that was to say, well, it is the consumer choosing that plan, as opposed to it being forced on you. So if you had a choice between, say, a 10 gigabyte plan, and let's say you use 9 gigabytes of data every month, optimally you would get a 10 gigabyte plan. But let's say you went to the store and you're like, hey, I could get 45 gigabytes for the same price. Well, why wouldn't I get 45 gigabytes? And now instead of using 9 gigabytes, maybe you use 20 gigabytes. There's still a lot of excess data, and the utility of the data is still in question. But you've found a way to use that extra data, and we figured that the consumer would also do that, and the market would also do that as well. So maybe we're steps away from a very data intensive app that everyone wants, that will now require that excess data that you weren't using. So we should assume that the public knows what they're doing when they make their purchase, and trust them. So that's kind of how we've dealt with that that kind of challenging index in a way.
That's wild. I've never considered any of that. It's really interesting to hear how you think about it. And you kind of went into this a little bit, but how do you guys respond to or incorporate feedback from that criticism?
So criticism, feedback, it's always welcomed. At the end of the day, again, the product that we produce is for Canadians, and they need to feel confident in our work. So if you have any criticisms, or you think we're doing something wrong, please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to take any criticism and try to make the product as good as we can, because at the end of the day, that's our goal. So as I mentioned, we also do public outreach, or try to reach the public as much as we can, regularly engaging with folks on social media and trying to respond to questions and comments in an honest and kind of professional way. And again, our work is supervised by an independent committee, and any questions that we might have about methods goes through that framework. So they can bring criticism to us. We can bring concerns that we might have about certain things to them. So there's a lot of forums for talking about that feedback and talking about that criticism. So again, we welcome it, and again, we're here for you as much as we can be.
One of the reasons we wanted to have you from someone from Statistics Canada on is that Mark and I interact with a lot of people who are very skeptical of Canada's inflation measures. They think that real inflation is like 20% a year or something, like completely ridiculous thinking, in my opinion. What's the main message that you have for listeners who are skeptical in a conspiracy theory type of way of the way that CPI is calculated?
It's a good question, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of answer it from our perspective. I think first and foremost, we want people to know that Statistics Canada is independent from politics. It's in our mandate to provide insightful and accessible data to support good decision making through trusted data, statistical services, and insights required to support these decisions. That's the kind of corporate speech that's on our website. But I think it's very, very true. On a more personal kind of basis, I work with around 140 dedicated public servants who are kind of vested in telling the truth. We're all kind of data wonks. And in the 9+ years or so that I've worked at Statistics Canada, there has not been one single instance of any type of political interference or any type of pushback. We do not share the data with our minister. We don't share the data with the government before it goes out to the public. We brief up, and so we brief up to the deputy minister level, who's appointed by the minister, but he's been a career statistician, really, really great guy who grew up in prices, worked in the national accounts, really, really intellectually honest. And I think for those reasons, people should be proud of. I'm proud of Statistics Canada, and I'm proud to work here. I think what Canadians expect and Canadians want in their public service and in Statistics Canada and the data is integrity and honesty. And I think that's also what we want. So we we push that, and we try to, again, be as honest as we can and as forthcoming. Everything that we've talked about is available on our website. We're fully transparent with our methodologies. If there's nothing, if people want to know more information or want to reach out to us and yell at us or praise us, we're happy to make those conversations and try our best to kind of convince folks that they should trust us, or that the numbers that they're getting are worth their time. We also know that we're not perfect, and that we're kind of always striving to be that, or trying to improve the product. We recognize certain limitations. There are data limitations that come into place, and we can try our best to kind of get to there. It's fair to be skeptical, and I appreciate the skepticism, because I think it will produce a better product in the end. Because if you say, hey, why aren't you doing this, or the complex discussion I just had about cellular, if you're like, well, that's hogwash, and you guys should think about this and this and this, maybe we should, and we would welcome that conversation, and welcome any insight that we can gain from folks who are smarter than us on some of these subjects, for sure. Because again, it's about producing the best product that we can.